Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. If you're in the chat, please jump in and tell us where you're coming from today. Really thrilled to have you. We're going to go ahead and get started. I expect over the next couple minutes, more of our colleagues will be joining us. I am both incredibly honored and super excited to have over 200 registrants today, which means the chat could get really lively. So I've got colleagues here from ASU and UTO that will help me keep an eye on the chat. I really do encourage you to keep that conversation going, because as we're talking today, I'm going to try to pull out themes from there and really make sure that the things that are happening as you are discussing this get woven into the conversation that we're having today. Welcome so much to all of you for Data Privacy Day. This is Data Privacy Week. So if you've been watching on social media, a lot of us across the country and in fact across the world are really having deep discussions around data privacy. And this is going to be one of them. So welcome. We're going to have a wonderful panel discussion, but before, just a little bit about the context of today. Hashtag Stay Safe Online. You can go see a whole bunch of threads of the conversations that have been happening this week. Lots of cybersecurity professionals, but then lots of others too, having this discussion. And there's more information about how to protect your privacy, some really great tips, both available from UTO. We'll share some resources at the end. And then of course, you can learn a lot more from the National Cybersecurity Alliance, who's helping put the momentum into events like these across the country this week. We're going to kick off by watching an Apple ad. I've been absolutely fascinated since, well, let's say August of last year, as Apple and Google were ramping up to their new flagship phones, going into the iPhone 13, going into the Pixel Pro 6. We saw a very different kind of advertisement. So let's take a minute and actually watch one of those.
Felix?
You need me to do anything? Can we cue the video?
Name?
Here we are. Thanks, Seth.
Felix? Name?
Felix.
Date of birth?
November 5th, 1986.
Tracking current location.
Can I have a taste of your ice cream?
Here's what you spent last month.
Crumbs from your table. Can I interfere in your crisis? Can you hear those people behind?
This will help with the itching.
Can I have a taste of your ice
Okay, that's a pretty incredible, very beautifully produced and super scary ad. And I love that we're publicly and marketing teams are starting to have this conversation. While at the same time, I'm pretty worried that there's the notion that if you have a flagship phone, then all sorts of privacy options are available to you. If you don't, well, are they available to you? And what exactly are we talking about with this crazy world we're going into? So in the chat, please feel free to remark on what we just saw with Felix as he was gloriously getting a coffee and kind of starting his morning off, and gathered more and more people who were watching and knew things about him, and then having their own conversations about the data that he left along the way for his day. Love to see some conversation in the chat around what you just saw. Oh, you guys are way too quiet. Yeah, they did a really good job of capturing what it actually feels like. And I love the fact that we're actually having these kinds of conversations and that ads like this are showing up online. Another one that we're seeing quite a bit of over the weekends during Super Bowl ads is from Indeed. Anybody hands if you've seen the Indeed ad? You know, young woman's interested in jobs, and Indeed is smart enough to ask her, hey, Did you also have this experience? Lots of inference there. They're making from pretty incredible information that they're able to extrapolate from everything she's told them. It's great that they can actually submit more to her resume, add more context that she may not think of. Those are wonderful things to be able to do, but also pretty powerful things to be able to do. Christine. Yes, indeed. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that you don't have any reason to be. Absolutely. And those lines are very blurry. Give me a moment here. We'll go back. We'll go back. Sorry, guys. This is what happens when you have me drive. So today we're going to talk to three pretty incredible researchers. Is everybody here? I know I saw Ben and Toby. Elma is here too. Go back one. Ah, sorry. My mouse is being pretty wild this morning. Hey, Ben. Now you guys can see everything that I've been working on. Can I bring this one back to the floor? I don't know, guys. We're driving like wild. There we are. Sorry for that. There it goes. And Jennifer, thank you for the glee as we figure out how to roll around and I introduce our students today. Elma, Toby, and Ben have joined us with some pretty incredible research that they're all embarking on and some really fantastic discussion. Without much ado, because I've given you enough of that, I'm going to start straight in and ask each of them to introduce themselves. Toby, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. I'm Toby Shulruff. Pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm Toby Shulruff, and I'm in the master's program of public interest technology in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. And I also work at the intersection of gender-based violence and technology. So we look at a lot at the implications of devices and data systems in terms of that impact for survivors of violence, as well as ways that those systems might help to support their choices and their safety.
Thank you, Toby. It's great to have you here. Ben, welcome.
Thank you. Really thrilled to be here. Thanks for the invite. My name is Ben Gansky. I'm a PhD student at ASU's School for the Future of Innovation and Society. I'm also a fellow at the NSF NRT program that we have at ASU in citizen-centered smart cities. I come from a kind of left field academic background. My previous career was in the arts. I have 2 arts degrees, but my work now focuses on translating complex concepts like data privacy and data governance to broad audiences, as well as specifically policymakers. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here and to have this conversation with you all.
We're glad to have you here too. Elma.
Hi, I'm Elma Hajric. I'm also in the same program Ben is. I'm a second-year PhD student. Our program is called Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology. I'm also in the NRT NSF grant on citizen-centered smart cities. And my research is kind of broadly in data from a critical perspective. I'm interested in data governance frameworks, as well as smart city narratives that are emerging.
So I think I'll just start off and ask you three, like what comes to mind when you watch the experience we just saw Felix had? I'm not going to call on you.
No, sorry. I think that it's a really entertaining way of approaching a topic that can be complex and just gives a good visual representation that I think can help people who aren't aware of that and someone said this in the chat, to better understand like what's happening in our day-to-day lives with the technology that we have. I would say that as much as I understand that it simplifies this visual storytelling, I'm concerned that it shows the barista and the rideshare driver following him, because it isn't everyday people sort of trying to get by in their jobs who are the ones who are doing the tracking. That really kind of obscures the fact that it's the companies behind these apps, it's companies that are making a lot of money off of our data who are doing that tracking. So again, I understand that that's part of the storytelling in the ad, but I think that we need to look deeper and say, why is this happening and what can we do to shift it? And it's not by asking the barista not to follow us into the car.
So that's a great question. Like along the line of actual people making actual decisions about what data they're interested in and how they're going to use it, like who does have culpability along that line?
I think that's a great direction to take the conversation in. I think that, well, first of all, I think the short answer is the people who are constructing business models and constructing the web of contracts and regulatory agreements that license those business models. So we're talking about people in C-suites, we're talking about their lawyers. I think that it's, sure, it makes for a very watchable advertisement. But as someone who's done enough storytelling in my life also, you make choices for reasons. It's not just, you could make an exciting advertisement that has a different perspective on this, but what does this do? Who does this benefit? This puts the focus on the individual and the idea that their choices, specifically their choice to buy an Apple product, are what is going to make them safe in terms of data privacy. And I think Toby made a great point as well, that it's saying that the people who are pursuing are workers, are everyday people, when that's not the case. So how does this commercial, number one, constrain the conversation so we think about just the individual person and their choices, but two, also not just saying this is the choice that you're going to make, you're going to buy an Apple product, but who has that option and who doesn't have that option to buy the most expensive gadgets on the planet? This, I think, also risks turning privacy, at least in the way that Apple would like us to think about it, into a luxury good.
I think the visual of this is pretty powerful. I think it captures the sensation that we all get when you're just browsing and all of a sudden you have an advertisement for something that you've never Googled, you've never talked about. You were just like thinking I should buy toothpaste, and suddenly it's like, you should buy this toothpaste. And you're like, how did you know that information about me? I never told you any of that. I think it captures that like crowded intrusion that an individual feels. But I do agree that the conversation should be a little bit broader than just even the corporate focus of harm. I think, this captures a lot of the business model harm and portrays Apple as kind of a different route, but how does Apple then function with government surveillance? They're still subject to the same exact laws and exceptions that, when a government asks for that data, they have to hand it over.
I love that you brought that up, and I might ask you to go a little deeper on that, because I know a lot of your work focuses on smart cities. And I'm here in a historical district in downtown Phoenix. And lately, my neighborhood social media page has been kind of blowing up around the Waymo vehicles. And there are a lot of Waymo vehicles hanging out in the Garfield, Coronado, Willow historic districts. So can you talk more about how you see that relationship between what's happening in the private sector and companies trying to figure out navigating it, and then what happens actually in our cities and the governance on that side?
Sure. I think it's really an exciting area for a researcher to look at, even if it's concerning from our side sometimes. I think the concept of self-driving cars sounds really amazing. If I have to go somewhere and I can just sit in a car and it can take me anywhere and I can sleep, on my trip to New York across the United States from here. I think that sounds like a great promise, but I think it's a little too good to be true. I think we have a lot of safeguards that need to be implemented in this process. And I think the smart city technologies that are emerging are overhyped a lot of the times. And there are a lot of researchers like Meredith Broussard who talks about the limitations of computing and the limitations of artificial intelligence. She wrote a book called Artificial Unintelligence to kind of hammer in that point that, we are just doing math in this sense. And on the governance end, something that concerns me a lot in smart cities is there's a hands-off approach a lot of the time. There are innovation districts where the power is granted more and more for tech industry to play and to test whatever they want to on whoever they want to with no consent from the other end and maybe no even awareness that they're being surveilled.
Well, and I want to pull a little bit on that thread around the awareness of being surveilled, and then maybe some of Ben Archer. Hello, Ben. Thought in the chat about whose responsibility is it? The data subject's responsibility. Toby, I think your work really does strike at the heart of a lot of those kinds of issues.
That's so true. A lot of these ideas of like whether we get to choose whether we have cookies on the websites that we visit or whether our apps are tracking us assume that we have a choice. And there are so many factors on a social level in terms of how we are coerced into accepting those things, right? It's better for you, get more personalized experience. We can give you suggestions that you're gonna like better rather than just random ads. And there's all this nudging to get us to accept this data extraction. And that really plays out on an interpersonal level in the work that I do, again, with that assumption that we have a choice. I have a choice about whether I share my password with my partner or whether I let them use my phone, when in a context of an abusive relationship, that choice is gone. And it mirrors that coercion on a social level because there are consequences if I say no, right? And those might be harm, they might just be other negative consequences. So I really like to look at these parallels between what is playing out in abusive relationships on an interpersonal level with what's happening on a social level, and how that sort of conditions future generations to accept a level of surveillance, to accept a level of coercion that we maybe find unacceptable if we step back and take a look at it.
Yeah, those are wonderful considerations. And I see Jen Jones has mentioned too, like, are we expecting a certain level of technology savvy, acumen, education to be able to navigate and be good stewards and protect ourselves in such a space? That's, I think, really, really thoughtful conversations that we need to be very actively and intentionally having, especially at an organization like ASU, where our mission is access. Now, Ben, tell us a little bit more about your work in this frame.
Sure. I think that Jen's comment about tech education and acumen is actually a good kind of entry point. I think that the expectation here of individuals, again, to take on the responsibility, Jen also mentioned earlier, the analog to environmentalism, this idea that we should be as individuals or consumers responsible for our carbon footprint. I think that the expectation there of individuals is sky high and extraordinarily unreasonable. If you think about how many terms and conditions we click through every day, we can't possibly, no human, there's been studies that have shown that, like, to actually read all the words in those terms and services that you agree to every time you use a piece of modern software, it would take you like 4 years. And so they're constructed to be impossible to navigate. They're constructed to be deeply complicated and obscure. That's by design. That's to simultaneously affect on us this idea that we're responsible, and also make us completely unable to effectively evaluate our choices that we're supposed to be able to exercise. I think, again, this is, when I say this is by design, going back to the environmental analog here, it turns out that the idea of carbon footprints was engineered by BP in collaboration with a PR firm in the early 2000s. It's not some kind of natural idea that floats out in the world. These ideas about responsibility get created. What is obscured by that idea of individual choice, individual responsibility? actually a lot of the way that data privacy is consequential to our lives. There are absolutely limited cases, and Toby and Elma's work both, I think, brings up really pertinent, really urgent examples of contexts in which if someone knows something about me personally, I am in danger of harm. But there are many, many instances where harms may come to you, you're exposed to risk, not because someone knows information about you individually, but because they think that they can place you in a certain cohort, in a certain group. And this is how privacy, we also have to understand, becomes a team sport. I'll give two examples of this. One is if I go and I want to get car insurance, right? They want to ask me for certain information about myself, some of which, feels legitimate. What's my driving record? This kind of thing. That seems pertinent. But also they'll want to ask me demographic information about myself. Why do they want that information? Well, it's so that they can identify me as part of a cohort, right? They're going to say, okay, early 30s, male, lives in this area. Okay, I know how to slot this guy. What do they do with that information? Well, they take all the information they have about other white guys in this area at this age, and they evaluate all the data they have from those other people to have this profile of what I might be like. And so it doesn't matter if I have an Apple phone, if I disable cookies, if I take every possible action that I as an individual can, if other people who are in this particular cohort that I'm in behave differently, if their data privacy is maybe less rigorous, let's say. So, and I don't know in advance what kind of slices of cohorts I'm going to be sorted into. I could be sorted into, fans of this TV show or people who bike or whatever. I don't know in advance. But the point is that I can't possibly, through my own actions, account for the way that someone who has the data and has those predictive mechanisms, like a car insurer, is going to see me. And then the second way that this is important is if we think about the idea of privacy as like going back to environmental framings, that this is like an ecological thing, that the more data that gets out into the environment, it becomes like pollution. And our ability to feel safe wherever we go into a particular context, like when we see our doctor, is that information about that visit, let's say, particularly if this is going to be like telemedicine, how is this going to propagate to other parts of my life? And so we start to internalize this idea that our information environment is insecure and in some way toxic. And it starts to affect the way that we see ourselves and the way that we behave. Again, this is not something that you can compensate for through your individual action. So this is some of what I'm thinking about in my own work here.
I think the environmental parallels are interesting, as are the way we actually talk about it. Is maybe 6 or 7 years where I can remember the first instance of a discussion around data exhaust, which certainly has pollution as part of its connotation, or the phrase "data is the new oil." So definitely parallels inside of that industry, just in the way we even encourage and have the discourse, whether that's a discourse around business models or a discourse about, well, this is exhaust. And so if we're actually doing something with it, that's a good thing, right? We're harnessing something that's otherwise an unused resource. Is it a good thing? Toby? It's not always a good thing.
I think that there is an underlying assumption that the more data we have, the better choices we're going to make. And I think this gets to a point that Elma raised earlier, which is that the ways that we're making sense of that information are far more important. And there's a lot of assumptions that underlie those, which leave people who are already most vulnerable more disadvantaged and disproportionately targeted by that data. So if we're making assumptions about cohorts, that might be, I'm not even sure I would call it innocuous to have, an ad served to you or to have something marketed to you, but the way that forecloses certain choices that we have within society because of that. So if, you look at the example of predictive policing, right? Drawing on data that's both publicly available and mined from other sources, we're making assumptions about people who live in certain neighborhoods and the degree to which they might end up, having criminal behavior. And those choices narrow down or those determinations narrow down life choices, and they set a course or limit certain courses that we might take. And when that comes up in the lives of survivors, that could be ability to access housing, ability to get a job, the degree to which data on the internet from data brokers, from publicly available information is being used before someone even reviews an application or has the opportunity to interview for a position or for housing, and that's closing down their choices. It means that survivors of violence are less likely to be able to find safety, are less likely to be able to find financial empowerment, to be able to have a healthier relationship or to be in a safer situation. And then it's also impacting communities of color and other communities who are targeted by these decisions based on those cohorts that Ben was talking about.
So yeah, I really love the way you're thinking about some populations. And I think it is so easy for us not to realize the implications of buying in to the general opportunities available to us. Like, I'll use, again, my historic home as an example. I don't actually have a doorbell because I guess doorbells weren't a thing in 1928, or maybe they were a thing and it was an actual bell, which has long since deteriorated or blown away in a monsoon. So I don't have doorbell, and it is incredibly attractive to set up a smart home and have a ring and watch somebody come up to the porch, and frankly, it'll be 3 feral cats and an occasional delivery person. Very attractive idea, and yet on the other hand, some of these aren't necessarily the most ethical, and we're not necessarily thinking about the fact that now there's Amazon Sidewalk and mesh capabilities that are actually pulling those together in unanticipated ways. I think, Elma, that kind of draws into some of your work around ethics.
Yeah, I love what Toby brought up. I think it's really important to have that distinguished acknowledgement that this technology and the data harms are disproportionate to certain groups, and what might be innocuous or quote unquote innocuous in a car dealership or buying car insurance if you're a white male becomes a completely different thing if you're installing a home security system and you're in a Muslim household or you're in a Black household. And you're unaware that that information is connected to your police departments. And you think you're being safe and that you have the control, but we don't think about, if I can surveil my home, who else can surveil my home? I think that part of, recognizing that these harms come disproportionately to certain groups of people and individuals is important. And I like to talk about it a little bit more in the context of surveillance versus privacy, because privacy is so individualistic. And it does put a lot of onus on the individual to be like reading those terms and conditions and figuring out that information, even when it's very obscure and not transparent.
Well, I want to pull us back to who's got responsibility for trying to figure this out, and how do you work through that tension of the kinds of things that we can do as people that, if you go to staysafe.org, they're going to give you some really great ideas for how to configure your phone and what to say with cookies, versus what we might ask policymakers or companies themselves or regulatory agencies to come in and help us out with. Can you speak a little bit to those tensions, and where are the levers that we could be pulling that aren't necessarily putting all of the onus back on us to make this all a safe and private place?
I think that there's a role for regulation and for policymaking. I think that those processes can be rather slow and contentious, as we see in our national policy landscape right now. So I think that there's also a need for industry actors and corporations to be more responsible in this regard, whether they're pressuring each other to do that, whether they're developing standards in common that can help guide them on this. There's certainly a growth amongst the technology companies in what they call their trust and safety teams in coordination with policy teams and legal teams, right? And so some of what comes out of that can be those endless terms of service that Ben was talking about that become so burdensome to us and are really more geared towards sort of CYA for the companies rather than necessarily empowering users. But there is a role, I think, internal to companies and the decisions that technologists and privacy professionals who are in those companies to make. Earlier this week, I was attending a conference of privacy professionals as they sort of sort through how do we remake the way that we do cookie acceptance? How do we remake the way that we share that information so that it is more user-centered? So there is a movement at foot sort of within workers themselves in the technology industry to have these practices be better. And I think that it has to be in coordination, right? Because the companies can move faster than regulation can, but also I don't think that we as people, as residents, as citizens, can just expect that companies are going to do the right thing because they're under market pressures and because they are profit driven as well. So it has to be some combination of like multi-levels. Like we can take our individual actions, but we shouldn't be the ones who are responsible as individual consumers, right? But we also need that public policy, and then we also need industry to shift the way that it does business.
This is the, we come back a couple times to these terms of service and how god awful they are. There's a wonderful art installation called I Agree, where an artist actually printed them all out in something like 2 hours worth of luxuriant reading if you actually want to read Instagram's terms of service. I'm curious in the chat if anybody actually has read through a terms of service and if they had any horror in the process. I did read very carefully the Samsung one the first time I got a smart TV, and stopped cold at the place where they said that they were going to take any audio that the TV heard and transition it back to the headquarters in Korea. Not that I think that anybody at Samsung is necessarily nefarious, but the way that was worded, it was absolutely no holds barred. Anything they heard would be able to go back. And that's, not necessarily, I have all sorts of inane conversations that I don't necessarily want anybody to hear. Ben, I want to, because you've also brought up legal. I have talked to attorneys who basically tell me the longer terms of service is probably the more legally appropriate and correct and protective of the company themselves. So are we actually encouraging, like, is our legal and framework encouraging radically unreadable terms of service? And then, like, how do you break out of that?
Yeah, I think that the short answer is yes, that we're seeing increasingly Baroque CYA. And I think that to go back to, I think this links back to the question you just asked about what are some avenues forward. And I think that there is a extraordinarily prevalent tendency to try to solve these problems within the power structures that currently exist, which is to say that the whip hand is held by the companies who create these products, in part because, as Toby mentioned, they move faster than regulators and legislators, and in part because structurally the power is theirs. And there's also a high degree to which that regulatory gridlock is engineered by those companies as well through regulatory capture. And I'll kind of hit on three different buckets of, I think, alternatives. Number one is to strike at the structure of concentration of corporate power through antitrust. And there's been a very interesting movement for the first time in over a generation in terms of how antitrust is understood. For a long time, since the 1970s, 1980s, the United States has had this doctrine of consumer harm, which basically means that unless or until someone's paying more for a product or service than we think that they would otherwise, there's no reason to examine corporate concentration. And that picture has shifted now, in part because a lot of the services that have created the infrastructure for our modern world of communications and semi-automated or fully automated services, they're free, right? Facebook is free, Instagram is free. How can you possibly mount a case against them that someone's paying more than they should? And so there's all of these other kinds of environmental effects, again, if you will, that that old doctrine didn't well account for, but is now changing with the current director of the FTC, and there's a number of other people who are highly placed right now in the Biden administration. And that is, I think, a really, really important movement, because when you have a monoculture online, right, there's a kind of infamous quote about the internet. The internet is currently now 5 websites filled with screenshots of the other 4. And so when you have a concentrated ecosystem like this, if Facebook has a problem, we've seen this, just a couple months ago, Facebook had an outage for like, I don't know, I think 48 hours or less than 48 hours. You know who was affected? The UK's NHS, because the nurses in the United Kingdom had begun to use WhatsApp for their own internal communication infrastructure for who's taking what shifts. When you have a private company that then essentially provides the infrastructure for health services halfway around the world, this is a critical point of vulnerability. And so by breaking up the power and the concentration, the scale of these different companies, we can create not just more system stability overall, but actual options for people to, they have to compete for people's business. So antitrust is one. Another is like regulatory floors. Sorry, go ahead, Toby.
Before you go to the next one, I think there's a really interesting point that you hinted at there, which is that these are global systems, right? That it isn't just about whether we regulate that in the US or whether we do antitrust here in the US, but that these companies are international and the technologies that we're using are global and they have impacts. And rarely do those other countries have, say, and beyond the EU with GDPR and other structures, have a say in what data is being collected and what's being done with it. And I know that that people who are advocating around privacy in other countries in the global south are saying that this is just a new kind of colonial extraction, right? Before you were taking our resources, you're still taking our resources because that's what the phones are built out of, right? But you're also extracting our data and then using that for profit as well, beyond just what's happening here sort of in the global north in the US.
That's a fantastic point, Toby. Do you want to get in a point, Elma? We can go in rounds here because I could just tee these up for y'all.
Yeah, these are great. I am very much enjoying this conversation. I think something that I find interesting in the global approaches to creating data protections is they always have exemptions around national security. And I think that is a huge bottleneck if the government, including the United States government, doesn't have an incentive to protect privacy, or if they're able to build in backdoors. I know Australia had a huge issue with requesting that every company has backdoor access for the government. And then that has a lot of security implications. But also, I think privacy is something that we focus on too much in legislation. I think we need to expand it a little bit more to be comprehensive and talk about digital human rights, because it's one thing to have legal protection against, terms and services, and to have a mechanism for people to be able to have complaints through the FTC or after the fact. But I think we need to upstream a lot of these rights to be part of a constitutional right, and then have people build these products on top of that, recognizing these are basic rights that you have to account for in your product development. I just think there's a more comprehensive thing to look at, but also to pay attention to the fact that governments don't want you to have data privacy.
That's Elma said the second bucket that I was going to touch on better than I could, which is, that we need digital human rights. There needs to be a floor that I think is legislatively arrived at. And I would just add that to Elma's point about just to draw out this idea of we have upstream and downstream, right? We have kind of due diligence on one end of a governance of a system, and then the back end of the governance of the system typically is some kind of oversight or remediation, adjudication, conflict resolution mechanism. Currently, those are entirely contained within these corporate buckets. And so creating a democratically legitimate way of thinking about this upstream and downstream governance, I think is important. The third bucket, and I'll be short about this, is one that we might think of as like abolitionist, which is to say, we don't just want to make a particular system friendlier or less biased or more able to accommodate your privacy or something. Some of these systems shouldn't exist. And some of these systems also, the way that data is extracted and potentially used to make someone vulnerable, I think that we focus a lot, this also ties into something that Elma mentioned, but we focus a lot on voluntary associations and voluntary transactions. I want to buy something on Amazon, or I'm going to apply for a job even. But again, tying back into the conversation about equity, if you are in an interaction with the police, if you are the target of surveillance by an intelligence agency, foreign or domestic, if you are applying for unemployment benefits, if you are having any interaction with the government around social safety net, these are involuntary interactions, or if they're voluntary, right, they're not true. They don't really feel like they're voluntary. And some of these structures, I think we should not just question, how do we make this more privacy respecting, but should this infrastructure exist? Even if we did a perfect version of the thing, should we be doing this thing in the first place? And to Elma's point also about privacy as a way to channel the conversation, privacy can frequently be used in these conversations to keep us from asking those kinds of first principles questions. Is this a thing we should be doing in the first place?
I see some parallels there to work specifically with domestic violence survivors, right? There is a huge pressure from essentially public funders, government funders, to report over information. And part of that is just, I mean, that makes sense, right? If you're receiving money, you should be able to say we're actually doing something with that money, and we're doing it in a way that actually provides services to all communities, and that we aren't, only narrowly focusing on one group. However, there's also something that I think is a legacy from the 1990s and welfare reform, which is this presumption that people who are asking for services or people who do encounter law enforcement are somehow trying to get away with something, right? That stereotype of the welfare queen, right? As opposed to saying people have needs and government is there to help meet those needs. And so as a result of that, we want you to prove that you're actually worthy of this. And we want to be able to collect data across your lifespan to show that our investment is paying off. Right. And so what that looks like on a day-to-day level is when someone comes to a shelter, for example, for emergency housing because it's not safe at home, and they're asked to fill out 5 pages of forms before they can have that, even if you say, you know what, you actually don't have to answer any one of these questions. If it's the difference between me thinking that I'm going to have a place to sleep tonight, and that's true for domestic violence survivors, it's true for people who are on the streets and just need to be warm for the night, right? If someone's saying, give me this information and then I will give you a meal and I'll give you a place to sleep, that's not choice, right? That takes the element of my own agency and my ability to consent to that. So we are frequently asking people to step back and say, why do you ask the questions that you ask? Do you actually need that? Who is asking you to ask that? And can you push back against that? Rather than just sort of going with the flow of that system, that more data is better data, and that somehow it's acceptable to ask these questions of people who are in crisis or in trauma.
Toby, I love that. And I think, thinking through participatory privacy and how you engage in that and how we ask individuals engage in it. There's some really real reasons though, right? To try to understand things that we don't understand, or to try to get insights during a time of a pandemic about who's actually impacted and how, especially when we don't know so much. I think that COVID-19 is actually a great example. By the time we actually start understanding what's happening with the virus, it is far ahead of us. So the science is trying to collect in an absolute abysmal data environment, which is not just a technology problem, right? It's actually the nature of how the virus works. So I'm curious, from the three of you, how do you walk that tension between where we want to have a kind of, Ben, I think you've talked about the collective, like we want to be able to offer these things so that we can actually see injustices, so we can actually see the challenges and understand them better and help solve them, while at the same time protecting the individual.
Yeah, this is a perfect kind of lead into one of the other kind of big ideas that I wanted to introduce to the conversation, which these are not my own. I'm just, the broker here. But if I go to the doctor, I don't want I want the doctor to know all of the health pertinent information about me. The doctor's office is a place where privacy is really important, but it doesn't mean that I want my health information to be secret from my doctor. In fact, I want them to have like the easiest, most frictionless access to like every, doctor's note that was ever taken on me. Similarly, for the pandemic, right? This is a urgent instance where, yeah, we really want to funnel the relevant data to the right people. Privacy is not the same as secrecy. There's a privacy scholar named Helen Nissenbaum who really thought through these ideas in a deep way. And her answer to this kind of conundrum of what is privacy if it's not secrecy, she has this phrase, contextual integrity. What does it mean? It just means that I want health information to stay in the health sphere for me. I don't want my health information going off to like, my financial advisor or something if I had one of those. And I don't want it to go the other way either. I don't want, my CPA, again, if I had a CPA. I'm a PhD student, what are you gonna do? I don't want that financial information to then go into the sphere of health. I don't want these different kind of, it's like we're going to Ghostbusters territory here. You don't want the streams to cross. The point is that I actually want information flow in particular domains, but I want it to stay there. So the question becomes, how do we, instead of just taking this kind of fuzzy idea of privacy as secrecy and just saying, "Ooh, let's stop communicating everywhere." That doesn't seem viable. It seems like we're leaving a lot of benefits on the table if we do that. How do we, though, who do we trust to ensure that these spheres are going to remain separate, but that information can flow freely within each one? This is the big question. But I think that this idea of information flow within the domain actually becomes a really important, maybe it's subtle, maybe it's not, but it's I think, an important layer to the conversation.
Donna, earlier you brought up the metaphor of data as oil, and I think it's the author James Bridle, who's a technologist and an artist, who pointed out that data is less like oil and more like radioactivity, right? That it is not something that goes away, right? It has this half-life that continues on, and I think that gets to the Ghostbusters crossing the streams. Also, it can be explosive and have these lasting legacies. So we need to have care with that, and we need to be clear about what the underlying assumptions are behind why we're asking for the data that we are and what we hope to come from it, and have more voices involved in the decision making around that upstream, as Elma's saying.
You had what I thought was a really elegant phrase in our first meeting, where you described, and I think I'm going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said emerging technology doesn't have foresight. And I really think that's an interesting way of describing the technology problem, because we are chasing the affordances that technology can bring us, right? The opportunity that it has to create some kind of benefit in our lives. But can you talk a little bit more about that? How would you even start to try to think better about foresight in that kind of lens?
I think the pandemic is a great example of looking at this a little bit more in depth, because we want to collect as much data as we can to understand this virus, and it's a public good to understand this virus and to make appropriate regulations and choices in our personal lives and as a collective, even globally, regarding the pandemic. But a lot, I wrote a little commentary piece on techno-solutionism and COVID-19 apps, where a lot of the kind of knee-jerk responses were to create technological solutions, even though those technological solutions didn't actually have any kind of impact, while it also collected more data that was then abused by governments or the tech companies that are involved. And I do think, just on a tangent, that the tech companies did end up shaping up because there was so much focus on privacy and building in secure systems. But there's not a lot of foresight that goes on when we create these technologies that kind of are created with a solution in mind without thinking about the further consequences that those solutions have. If you have a COVID-19 tracing app that doesn't have the security and the privacy element built into it, that has a lot of consequences socially. If your friends are like, oh, this person has COVID, and there's just a lot that goes into the social factor. But also I'm reminded of Shannon Mattern's new book, A City is Not a Computer, where she has a chapter talking about dashboards and the data and the way that it's presented, and how not everyone has the capacity to even understand what they're looking at. Or sometimes you have that data presented in interesting ways that kind of obscure or make things less important than they are, or have a little bit of a political bent to them, or suddenly drop off pertinent information that make the data meaningless if you don't know how much you're looking at. For example, percent positivity rates at the ASU's new dashboard for COVID updates. I look at that and it's meaningless to me as a student. I don't understand what I'm looking at because it doesn't have the full capture of everything. I think sometimes being presented with as much data as possible, especially when we don't know about something like the pandemic, it can be a little bit just challenging to know what we're looking at and what decisions we're making.
Yeah, and linking to what you're saying, Elma, and drawing back to this earlier idea of like, what are the assumptions that we have about more data equaling better information and better decisions? That means that someone has to understand that data and then act on it. And I think that we have seen throughout the pandemic in the US context that even as we get better data, that's not necessarily acted on or turned into policy that fits what the data is saying, or the sense that we're making out of the data. And so I don't think that we can just assume that collecting even more is going to lead us to better decisions, which is true in the smart cities context. Oh, it'll be more efficient and it'll be more just and it'll be safer. But precedents that show us that those are necessarily the consequences of having more data and having more technology, having more sensors, having more surveillance. I don't think that we can assume that somehow it's going to be magically better the next time we try.
I'll just add to this discussion here by bringing, again, a kind of environmental analog. And just as a quick side note, I think that there are really good reasons, actually, why we keep coming back to environmental metaphors. A lot of the kind of same structural features of the problems of climate change and why it's been so hard for so long and so intractable to conceptualize and to figure out the right kind of responses to, a lot of those structural features are present when it comes to issues around data privacy, a kind of collective action problems, the diffuse nature and the intended and designed obfuscation between the producers of problems at scale and the people who experience those harms, the distribution of those harms predominantly on people who are already the most marginalized in society. So anyway, there's lots of good reasons why we keep coming back to environmentalism. Here's how I'll come back to it. Thinking about the precautionary principle. This is a framing of how we might want to make decisions with foresight that was first, or perhaps best known for being articulated in the 1992 UN Rio Declaration, which was one of the most landmark climate declarations that has been channeled through the UN. And to paraphrase, the precautionary principle basically says that we don't need to have incontrovertible proof that something will be harmful in order to take action to prevent that harm from happening. right? It's where the burden of proof is placed here. The upshot is that if you abide by the precautionary principle, then you're going to exercise foresight and you're going to say, okay, if there seems to be a risk to this course of action in the future, we don't know what that risk is going to look like, but if we think that the risk is going to be shaped like this, it's going to be this intense, it's going to cover this many people, we shouldn't let our lack of certainty prevent us from erring on the side of caution. That's the precautionary principle. It seems very sane, right? On the other hand, you go, well, who doesn't want to abide by that? Well, people who want to, it depends on your priorities here. If your priority is innovation, you say, well, that's going to slow down innovation. That's going to slow down our ability to do new things, to scale up, to make a lot of money. And there's all kinds of supporting narratives that we have in our culture that make innovation the priority, whether it's like geopolitical competition, we've got to stay ahead of China, this proposition of a kind of new Cold War narrative and a cyber arms race, this idea that we're locked in competition globally as well as within a country. And so we've got to keep competing. If we take too much time to decide what the harms might be and to be scared about them, we're going to lose our edge. Who does this benefit? Who does this harm? I think that this idea of precaution becomes a way that we can articulate the other side of this, which is not always easy because our culture has innovation as a motivation so close to the surface, so available for us. Whereas these other kinds of rationales for how we might decide what we want to pursue or preclude, those are a little bit less accessible to us. And I think it's something that we need to consciously work on in a kind of cultural way, that there are other values than profit.
Yeah. And I think to get back to your question earlier, Donna, which is like, what are those structures or techniques around foresight that public interest technology, building on responsible innovation brings in some of those approaches, which is to build into the process upstream, as Elma's saying, anticipation, right? To not get to the point where we say, oh, well, we just didn't see that coming. It's an unanticipated consequence. Instead, to build that into the development process itself, the design process itself, and to recognize that not only is there a lack of diversity within the technology industry in terms of leadership and decision makers, but that even if you have a more diverse looking team representatively, that it's still a particular mindset that is drawn towards design and development of technology. So you need more inclusive processes that design with users, with communities, with the most vulnerable communities as active participants. And then you need to be reflexive. You need to be aware of what those assumptions are that we've been talking about throughout that process. And you need to be responsive, not just do that work and sort of file it on a shelf, but it needs to be an iterative approach because even with the best approaches, there will still be some harms. And so how do you respond to those in a way that is not just a form flow that is impersonal, but that actually meets people's needs and then builds that back into the process. And I think that to return to anticipation, because that's sort of that core piece around foresight, is there are tools there, right? There's tools of scenarios. There are tools of co-design where you are working together with users and communities. There are tools drawn from technology assessment where you look at analogous cases, where you look at the trajectory of technology. And these are all tools that have been known for decades and used more extensively in Europe, but can be used in other settings as well and are being revived here in the US to say, how do we actually not make these mistakes, which may be avoidable?
When you're I love the suggestion that we would actually take some of these techniques, and I do agree that they're going to lean in on Ben's description of how immediately accessible they are. Like those practices are pretty accessible in, say, product or service design teams in Europe. But we're asking for what sounds to me like an extraordinary amount of like engaging in product or technology development with this kind of active listening and a critical thinking to actually say, hey, what did I just hear? Am I certain that that's what I heard? If so, what does that then imply? What are the follow-ons from that? Can I extrapolate from that to a reasonable scenario that would help me then to make better decisions now? At the pace that we tend to move technology forward, that we tend to, I think we've got strong iteration cycles, right? There's a lot of spirit of, well, iterate, learn. That creates a kind of tempo that makes it really challenging for teams, like actual teams who are, I don't know, coming up with beautiful data visualizations to try to tell great stories. That takes real time.
I think a great way to think about it is in the creation of these technologies, if we are asking ourselves how this would impact our kids or a kid. I like Toby's point on vulnerable people. I think that's a great way to create technology, to think about who is the most vulnerable in our society and how can they navigate this technology safely. Elderly, marginalized communities, kids. I really think like the question of how does this impact kids is a very powerful start and an easy way to start breaking down some of those unanticipated consequences and make them a little bit more part of the picture. Like, would you subject your kids to facial recognition? And would you subject your kids to have everything about them collected? So when they have a job application at 21, they can reference what they did in kindergarten and have that be part of their decision. I think that's a way to start breaking into this that's not so overwhelming.
But that's overwhelming if you're a young parent in the time of a pandemic and you've got, like, schools in and out of session, and to try to add on to that meaningful and reasonable techniques of, I don't know, understanding what's happening in that thing called Discord, or metering and throttling at all the experience of TikTok. That's non-trivial for a young parent or a busy professional who's trying to readjust their lives to an elderly parent. That's non-trivial stuff.
I agree. I think it's a lot to put on the onus of an individual trying to make their day-to-day choices, but I don't think it's a big ask to technologists who are creating, devices that have real harms. Like, one of the readings that I added was about privacy not being an abstract concept. Like, these are things that impact people severely in their day-to-day harms. It can get someone incarcerated even if they did nothing wrong, and the data just somehow points to it. There's a lot of heaviness that happens down the line, where I don't think it's too big of an onus on technologists to think about, how does this technology impact my child or a child? Because a lot of the times technologists are creating technologies in their own image. And usually that's a white male. And they're like, well, I would be fine if I did this, but there needs to be more conversation happening, and there needs to be more integration of social scientists in technological workplaces. Maybe at the ideation stage, be like, here are some things that you might want to think about as ethical challenges, because part of the legal framework is that, like, legal frameworks don't necessarily address ethics. They're just legal protections. They're not there to have judgments around ethics, and our courts aren't set up to judge ethics. So who does that responsibility fall on? And I do think it's the people creating the technologies.
I love the idea that we might rethink the face of technologists and think more broadly about who those individuals are and what kind of backgrounds they have coming in, which of course is easy for me to say as a history major and CISO, right? It is obvious to me that liberal arts or theater, Ben, is a wonderful entry point into thinking deeply about experience. And then coming from what experiences do you want people to have, that becomes a great design premise for technology. But that's easy for me to say, not obvious inside of IT spaces, or even how Indeed might think about hiring and how it might be facilitating or not the kinds of opportunities people are presented with. I want to take a minute because we're at about 10:10 and invite our audience to chime in. You can even come off camera and talk to us directly if you want to join into the conversation. I know that we have a lot of practitioners of this kind of work in the faces and some of you that I know. And I've been trying to kind of keep an eye on the chat, which is hard because you guys are really having a great conversation over there. So I'd encourage some of you to bring that thread in here, and we can spend the last 20 minutes or so that we have together diving deeply into some of the conversations that have been happening there. So an open invitation to jump in. We'll try to make that easy for you. If I start from the bottom up, we're going to end up talking about Roblox.
Donna, I can ask a question to get us going.
Hey, Karina. Yeah, please.
Hi everyone. Great discussion. Thank you so much. In the news lately, we've been seeing stories of people's experiences being tracked unwillingly by Apple tags or Tile devices. Do you have any thoughts on how to keep us safe from unwanted tracking devices?
So this is a topic that has that my day job spends a lot of time talking with people about, and so just to sort of get everybody on the same page, these tracking devices offered by a number of companies, most in the news recently, Apple, but also including Tile and other companies, are designed to sort of help you find lost items like your keys, for example, but they have been put in service since I first started looking at it in 2017 of stalkers. And I think the concern there is that when companies have sort of a smaller ecosystem, that it is more challenging to actually put those to the use that stalkers want to put them to, right? So you could put a tag in somebody's bag or in their coat, but it might not actually give them all that rich information about the real-time location of the person that they have tracked. However, it can still create fear and create that sense of being tracked and watched, which in itself is a level of abuse, right? So that's true. And then once you get to a larger ecosystem where you have a device that can be connected to so many other devices, then you do have something closer to a real-time location. And so the companies have all sort of made steps to make it easier for people who are worried about that to be able to discover if there's a device near them. Apple recently released a new app that can help Android users to negotiate whether or not one of the AirTags is near them, for example. But I think that it, again, the sort of narrow laser focus on location trackers, like these little devices that can be put in your stuff, are obscuring the fact that we have a lot of location tracking happening in a lot more ordinary ways, most particularly, with our phones. Right? The phone is a location tracker, and many of us are carrying them everywhere that we go. And particularly in an interpersonal level, if I am on a family share plan, or if I shared my location with family or friend or with my employer, they're going to know where I am all the time. And that information could be misused if there's not, trust or equity in that relationship. And then to that further point, to go back up to the social level, we then have all sorts of other people tracking our location and making inferences about what that means. And I think stepping back from that too, there's a way of looking, and I think this is more Elma's area, but looking at state surveillance, in that the location of our phones is triangulated by cell phone companies, and Senator Wyden's office, amongst other entities, have been looking into the way that data is sold to bounty hunters, to bondsmen, right? And how that data then makes its way into state services like law enforcement. So I think it's a concern not only of sort of the niche work that I do, but a broader social issue as well. And it goes beyond just one kind of location tracking. As the Internet of Things becomes ubiquitous, where everything is connected to everything else, it becomes even more difficult to have that kind of location privacy for anyone.
Well, and more difficult to even stay on top of it as trying to be an informed consumer. I just was terribly uninterested in reading the terms of service for my new LG washer and dryer. Just not even interested. What other questions?
The question of why are all of these appliances connected to the internet? What does that actually get us? Which takes us back to design and development of technology. What problem are we actually trying to solve, or is it just sort of a gimmick?
Right. Even thinking about my baby monitor, I have a security professional living in my home, so we do not have a Wi-Fi connected baby monitor. But even that is just terrifying as a mother. So I just appreciate you bringing that to light and making us take note of what's around us and just kind of like rethinking about it. So thank you.
What other questions do we have? I know some of the folks in this audience, so I can't believe that we don't have others that would want to chime in. Ben, you seem to have done a really great job of task switching and being able to watch both the chat and contribute. Was there anything in the chat that we should bring here?
It may be worth discussing some interesting live efforts at collective action here. I'm sure we probably all on this call have, an interesting, hey, this state bill, that thing. What I highlighted, Annie had asked, I think a very practical question, which is, okay, what's my takeaway here? What do I work on? And Elma gave the actually helpful answer, which is like, hey, here's a resource that'll give you answers to that question. I gave the unhelpful answer of like, there's not so much we can do as individuals, which, true and false, right? But what I had posted is like, hey, here's a collective action thing. Is a link about a bill that's recently been introduced, I believe, both in the House and the Senate. And what it's looking at is targeting advertising, right? That this is the kind of fundamental business model of the contemporary web is services that are subsidized by targeted advertising sales. And so I think that striking at kind of the heart of that business model, there's a kind of technology equity advocate out of Toronto named Bianca Wiley, who does phenomenal smart city advocacy work. And she sometimes says that we often make the mistake of bringing education to an incentive fight. And it's by striking at those incentives, at the business models, that I think we're actually going to get traction here, instead of trying to say, oh, well, it's just that teams of technologists need to understand more about other people's lived experiences. I think that we need to teach ethics courses to engineers. Those are all good things. Everybody deserves to have ethics courses. Would love for everyone to take a history class, because I think you learn things. That's cool. But if we actually want to make changes in the ecosystem here, I think it has to come from how we target incentives, because you would ask early on, Donna, who makes these decisions? It's not ultimately the engineers who get to kind of decide this thing. It's the C-suite. It's the people who say, here's going to be our fundamental business model. And it's by intervening at that level that I think we're going to get real traction.
We did have a good question come in from Jen Tweedy. Ben, I'd be interested to hear some more from you in the panel in the area of limiting data and the use of the data to specific spheres, like your example of healthcare.
I'll just toss out a quick answer and then volley to the expertise of all y'all, actually. Everybody's an expert here on this particular call. So if you've ever heard of land trusts, this is an interesting kind of thing here where, right, the idea is that you create an entity. Let's say I'm like, oh, man, I love my childhood home, but it's going to be, I'm terrified that after I die, it's going to be chopped up and turned into rentals, whatever. Something it's going to be turned into an amusement park. Something I don't want to happen to is going to happen to it. What you can do is you say, actually, okay, I'm not going to own my house anymore. I'm going to create a legal entity called a trust. It's going to own the house, and I'm going to create in like the bylaws of this trust, I'm going to legally create a contract that says this is what the house can and can't be used for, right? So you're transferring ownership to an entity that you are able to bind legally to do or not do particular things. Analogously, we've seen the emergence of a form of data governance called data trusts. And the idea here is that you are creating legal binding. Is that right? Legal bounds, right? You're constraining what can and can't be done with a particular set of data or a stream of data or data for particular people, particular data sets, right? This kind of thing. So I think that there's interesting creative work being done in this data trust space, particularly around like biomedicine and biostatistics. So I can post a link to this here that is about, okay, how do we try to maximize the benefits while having protection against what could be harms downstream?
I kind of want to answer this going back to the first example of, automated vehicles and smart cities and this idea of interconnected devices. I think one of the most harmful things about automated vehicles is that they try to gather as much information about you from every angle. And, they have software embedded with AI that can asserts that they can, read your emotions or, determine your personality or your mood, or we have Fitbits and all these wearable devices that kind of nudge your behavior in different directions. And I do see that there's a lack of foresight with a lot of the solutions. And I think data trust in particular lack a lot of this foresight about the more and more data that's being collected in singular technologies and how to regulate that and how to grapple with that, because is the answer to add another party to the mix? Is the answer to add someone else to be able to view all of this data? I personally don't think so. And I just think there's a real concern for congregating all of this data and just expecting it in your day-to-day life, especially in the context of vehicles. Why does, your car manufacturer need to know about your health status? That's, in my opinion, crossing the line. But your car seats have weight detectors on them. What if we get to a point where it's like, oh no, you can't go to McDonald's, you have to go to the gym. Your car's driving you to the gym. Or there are actual, I think more realistically, there are consequences that come based on your habits and your day-to-day activities, on your health insurance, on your car insurance, where these nudged behaviors can come into play. And I do think it's really important to try to keep these things separate. And someone mentioned HIPAA, and I think that's a great law, but it's only in certain contexts. HIPAA doesn't offer general protection, especially not in smart city spaces or automated vehicles. There's no protection against that once you've agreed to the terms and services. When you buy your Tesla, that's it. You agreed to them. They can do whatever they want now.
Yeah, and building on that, I think data trusts are one model that people are looking at. Another is the idea of decentralized identity, where you use something like blockchain technology, and we can have a separate conversation, probably not today, about blockchain, but the idea that I can have my own data and that I am the one who holds on to it, and I sort of open access or close access as I will to people who want that. And that could be built together with a model where people are actually compensating you for your data rather than it just being extracted from you and someone else is making a profit on it. But the idea is that I can then say, I want this doctor to know about it, but I don't want all doctors to know about it, or I want my doctor to know about this, but I don't necessarily want my insurer to know about that. And I think that's one of the underlying pieces of HIPAA, is that it is less about privacy and more about sharing. It is the regulation of sharing, because it is assumed that healthcare providers will be sharing that data amongst themselves, and Ben spoke to the benefits of that, but it's also shared with insurers, right? And so what are those consequences if it becomes known that I am a victim of domestic violence? And then how does that impact my insurance rates? How does it impact my ability to seek care in the future, or the way that I am, again, channeled into certain kinds of services or kept from others? So I don't know that it is without flaw. A lot of these initiatives are new and still need to be tested more. But in addition to this data trust, there's this idea of decentralized identity, and that we each hold on to that and make more affirmative choices about who we share it with, rather than it being an opt-out system, which I think someone in the chat mentioned. You have to spend so much time opting out. Why is it the default that we're opting out? I really love the principles summarized as FRIES by consentful tech. And this builds from a sexual consent model from Planned Parenthood, which is that consent should be freely given, that's the F, reversible, informed, based on informed consent, enthusiastic, which I think is a really high bar to aim for, and specific. And so that those principles should underlie the approaches that we have to privacy and to other choices within technology space.
Toby, I love that. Can you put fries in the chat, or can one of our colleagues capture that one? And then I think we may have a slide of resources, so I might ask folks to share that. We'll leave that up for the next 4 or 5 minutes. We'll also share this afterwards. But okay, those are links that no one can click on. So we will share that in a way that you can actually go and check all these things out. And then I've seen a large number of resources in the chat itself. So our team will take that away and we'll send to everyone and make sure that you have access to all the different links and resources that we've been talking about. I would love to pick up this conversation around selective disclosure, how we think about the invitation to consent and meaningful consent as a follow-on conversation. And we can talk about blockchain and distributed technologies and sovereign identity. And there are a lot of efforts at ASU and other institutions to really think at the heart of what that means for us. And we've got teams here that are doing some pretty incredible work. So I think that's a wonderful follow-on conversation to invite the three of you and our audience to participate in. We've got like 3 minutes left. So with that, I think we'll take a look at the chat and kind of keep an eye on it. But I want to really thank Elma, Toby, and Ben for being here today. This is exactly the kind of provocative and meaningful conversations that I really think are so important for us to be having. I'm a little bit bummed that like there's 1 week out of the year and 1 day out of the year where we get to celebrate this with hashtags, and I'd like to see more of these conversations. So I'm so glad that you're doing the kind of work that you're doing, that you're meaningfully dedicating this time of your lives towards how we think about these questions, and that you're here with us to talk about them today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Donna. It was a pleasure to be here. And Elma and Ben, it was fun to hash it all out with you.
Likewise. Thanks for the invitation, Donna.
Yes, thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone who joined and for the great comments and questions.
Fantastic comments and questions. Really great. And just we had folks joining in the last 10 minutes. So I imagine, folks that had to dash out for a Zoom a half hour and then came back. Pretty fantastic. And hopefully you were able to kind of come and go throughout the time that we had together this morning and still meaningfully contribute and listen to the conversation. We'll record all this and make this available to you as well. Thanks, everybody.